Hi, I'd like to continue now by discussing some of the most important ethical theories that are the foundation, really, of this business ethics course. I'm going to discuss utilitarianism, Kant's categorical imperative, as well as theories of justice. But first of all, I'd like to begin with utilitarianism. As you know from your reading, there are four major points to utilitarian theory. Number one, the whole idea behind utilitarianism is the idea of maximizing utility. In other words, when you make a determination about any particular course of action, you want to find the action which is going to give you the greatest net benefit, or the greatest good for the greatest number. This is sometimes thought of in terms of happiness, pleasure versus pain, but generally the idea of utility, usefulness, is the main idea that is used in our course of business ethics. Now, the second point, beyond maximizing utility, the second point is that in order to do that, it's important not to consider only oneself or one's company, but to consider all persons involved. All people who are hurt or benefited by your action must be considered in order to actually have an accurate assessment of what is going to be the final outcome. Thirdly, it's important not to take into account simply short-term measures. Suppose, for example, the government wants to raise taxes or lower taxes or impose certain taxes on oil or cigarettes or on restaurants or whatever. And that may seem like a good idea because it generates revenue for the government and they can use that for various projects. But suppose in the long term, this tax or this fee or whatever it is decided actually hurts the economy and actually prevents people from investing, prevents things from happening. The economy slumps, and what do we have? We have recession, we have different problems, and so the long-term benefits would be negative. So it's important, whatever you're deciding, whether it's a government thing or a personal thing, to think about both the long-term and the short-term benefits of what it is you're doing. And finally, many people think that from a moral standpoint, any action is okay as long as it maximizes you, or as long as it costs outweigh the benefits outweigh the costs. Pardon me. As long as the benefits outweigh the costs, but that's not true. The whole point behind utilitarianism is to find the one action which maximizes utility, which means producing the greatest net benefit. When all things have been considered, there is only one right action. All right? Only one right course of action. And that is the one that produces the greatest net benefit. All right? So those are the four main points. Now, just a little historical background here. Jeremy Bentham was the one who founded utilitarian theory, or began it. His purpose was, he was trying to analyze the laws which were passed by the British Parliament, because he felt that people passed laws which had very negative consequences for the public. And so he wanted to develop a way of looking at possible courses of action for the government in such a way that they could be analyzed before laws were put into effect, before they were passed, to try to analyze the laws and assess whether they would actually be helpful or harmful. Later on, John Stuart Mill took this theory and attempted to apply it to individual decisions, not just corporate decisions or government decisions, but to individual decisions about everyday sorts of matters. Now, there are many strong points to utilitarian theory. It reflects the way we think about life in general, right? When you're deciding whether to go to class or not to go to class, whether you're deciding whether to go to work or not to go to work, when you're deciding which course of action to take in response to some problem that you're having, we automatically weigh the costs and the benefits of what it is we're doing. And we tend to think that we will take the course which is most beneficial. Now, utilitarianism simply takes that way of thinking and expands it and says, let's think about all the people who are going to be hurt or harmed by our behavior. So it's a very useful way of thinking and a very intuitive way of thinking. Another good point to utilitarian theory is the fact that it takes into account many different options. So for governments or corporations who want to assess their possible courses of action, utilitarianism is a very sound, easy to manage way of thinking about the actions they're going to take and translating them into costs and benefits. So the benefit here is that when you take any particular action that you might pursue and you analyze its cost, you try to translate that into dollars and cents or some quantitative measure, which then can be measured against some other possible course of action. And the benefit there is that it gives you hard numbers, cold calculation. Well, if we do this one thing, it's going to cost us this much, it's going to provide this much benefit monetarily, it's going to provide a certain amount of cost. Compared to this other thing, you can actually weigh the final products of each calculation and decide which one's best. Now, of course, that's also the downside, because how do you determine the utility of many different kinds of actions? How do you determine, for example, the cost or the price of a person's life? When you're talking about things like life and health and other intangible things like this, it's very hard to determine what a life would cost or what it would be worth. Secondly, how do you determine what is a good? One person's, meat is another person's poison, so to speak. I might like disco dancing, so if someone's going to put a disco, well, that's kind of outdated, I know, but if you're going to put a bar, I might like to drink. If someone's going to put a bar on my street where I can go and have a beer after work, I might think that's a very good thing because I like to drink beer. But someone else may say, hey, it's going to bring down the prices of the houses in the neighborhood. It's going to ruin the neighborhood. It's going to cost people money on their houses. So that might be a negative factor. So what's good from one person's perspective is not necessarily good from everyone's perspective. How do you measure things when two people are competing for the same job? How do you know which one? If they're both equally qualified, how do you measure the benefit to giving it to one person or the other? These are the kinds of things that it's very hard to determine when talking about utilitarianism, and this is what makes it, from that perspective, a difficult tool to use for certain kinds of issues. And the final thing is, utilitarianism looks at the greatest good for the greatest number, which means that it's possible to do something which has a very powerful net benefit for a certain segment of the population, say the majority, but may be very harmful to another segment of the population. And so utilitarian theory says that if the good outweighs the bad enough, if it's the best, net benefit, then you have to do that. But this could infringe upon certain people's rights. This could, be very unjust or unfair. And utilitarianism does not deal well with that kind of analysis. So those are the weaknesses of utilitarian theory.